Welcome to PMP Exam Mastery, where we will bridge the gap between abstract theory and the practical realities of the certification exam. This chapter serves as your strategic foundation for navigating the syllabus and mastering the mindset required to pass on your first attempt. This is an unofficial, independently produced educational course. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to the Project Management Institute, PMI, or the PMP certification program in any way. All trademarks, including PMBOK, belong to their respective owners. This content is for educational and informational purposes only and does not guarantee exam success. In this course, we cut through the noise and complexity that often surround the project management professional credential. You will quickly learn how to organize your study efforts around the examination content outline rather than getting lost in the sheer volume of the PMBOK guide. We prioritize high-impact concepts that frequently appear as situational questions, ensuring your time is spent on material that provides the highest return on investment. By the end of this journey, you will possess not just the knowledge to pass a test, but a structured mental model for managing projects in any environment. If you want to achieve professional growth without wasting months on aimless reading, this is the most efficient path forward. Becoming a PMP is primarily about internalizing a specific project management philosophy rather than memorizing individual processes. The exam evaluates your ability to resolve conflicts, lead teams, and align deliverables with business strategies under pressure. We will navigate the shift from the traditional process group orientation of the 6th edition to the performance domain focus defined in the 7th edition of the PMBOK. This transition requires a shift in perspective, moving from a rigid, phase-based mindset toward a broader understanding of project health and value delivery. You need to understand how the 3 domains, people, process, and business environment, interact regardless of whether you're working in a purely predictive waterfall environment or a fast-paced agile setting. Understanding the ECO, or examination content outline, is the single most important task you have before you even touch a practice book. Most students fail because they try to study the PMBOK cover to cover, which is a recipe for burnout and confusion. Instead, we map every concept we cover back to the ECO, which outlines exactly what the examiners are looking to test in terms of task importance and domain weight. We will spend time discussing how to handle the 3-hour constraint and the different question formats you will face, including drag-and-drop exercises and multi-select complex scenarios. If you treat the ECO as your primary navigation tool, you'll find that the exam is far less intimidating and far more logical than most assume. Finally, we will address the psychological aspect of test taking, which is often severely underestimated by even the most experienced project managers. You must learn to read situational questions as narratives that require a decision, not just as a search for a definition. We will guide you through the Pearson VUE testing environment, the logistics of your exam day, and the ongoing requirements to maintain your PMP credential through professional development units. We aim for you to emerge from this program not only as a certified project management expert, but with a clear roadmap for lifelong professional development. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to the chapter on Core Project Management Fundamentals. We will establish the essential framework required to understand how projects operate within an organization. To understand project management, we must first distinguish between projects and operations. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result, characterized by a defined start and finish. In contrast, operations are repetitive, ongoing processes focused on sustaining the business and maintaining production. Confusing these two often leads to scope creep and misallocation of resources, as operations typically follow existing business logic rather than a unique roadmap. For instance, developing a new software module is a project, whereas providing user support for that module is an operation. Understanding this distinction allows a project manager to apply appropriate rigor and methodology where it is actually required. Failure to acknowledge this boundary often results in organizations attempting to manage routine business activities with the complexity of project management tools, or vice versa, causing significant inefficiencies. Organizational structure dictates how a project manager exerts authority and accesses resources. In a functional organization, teams are grouped by specialty, like engineering or marketing, and the project manager often possesses minimal power. Resources in these structures report directly to functional managers who prioritize departmental goals over project objectives. A projectized organization represents the opposite end of the spectrum, where the project manager maintains near total control over the budget and team members. Matrix organizations attempt to balance these interests, existing as either weak, balanced, or strong, depending on who holds the most significant influence over project decisions. Navigating these structures requires a deep understanding of organizational influence, as a project manager must often negotiate for time and resources rather than commanding them directly. These structural nuances define the arena in which you will function and dictate how you frame your requests to leadership. The Project Management Office, or PMO, serves as the central hub for standardization and governance within an organization. It does not necessarily manage the project itself, but provides the templates, policies, and methodologies that project managers must follow. By standardizing these artifacts, the PMO ensures that the organization can compare project performance across business units and maintain a consistent baseline for reporting. Beyond templates, a good PMO acts as a guardian of project strategy, ensuring that all individual projects align with the broader goals of the organization. If you encounter a situation where project data is inconsistent or reporting is chaotic, it often points to a lack of proper PMO oversight or weak governance. Recognizing the PMO's role helps you understand where to source support for documentation and where to align your project management style to meet enterprise expectations. Every project operates within a broader context defined by enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Enterprise environmental factors represent conditions that are not under the control of the project team, such as market conditions, organizational culture, and government regulations. These factors form the constraints and influences that you must acknowledge when planning, as they define what is physically or legally possible. Organizational process assets, conversely, are the internal resources available to you, including historical data, lessons learned from past projects, and existing templates. When you begin a project, your first step should always involve auditing these assets to prevent reinventing the wheel. Leveraging historical data from similar past projects can provide invaluable estimates for duration and cost, which effectively de-risks the early planning phases. Distinguishing between portfolios, programs, and projects is essential for long-term strategic alignment. A portfolio is a collection of projects, programs, and operations managed as a group to achieve strategic business objectives, often focusing on high-level investment decisions. Programs are groups of related projects managed in a coordinated way to obtain benefits that would not be available if they were managed individually. Projects remain the foundational unit where specific tasks are executed to deliver unique outputs. If you're managing a project, you must recognize if your work is part of a program or portfolio, as your communication cadence and success metrics will be tied to those higher-level goals. Misalignment here is a frequent cause of failure, as a project may be technically successful but fail to deliver the intended value to the portfolio. Project governance provides the framework within which project decisions are made and ensures that the project remains aligned with stakeholder expectations. As a project manager, your sphere of influence extends well beyond your direct team members to include sponsors, functional managers, and external stakeholders. You function at the intersection of these competing interests, using influence and negotiation to resolve conflicts that arise from resource constraints. Successful project management involves mastering this influence, as the most technically sound plan will fail without the support of the organization's power structures. You are the bridge between the technical reality of the project work and the strategic expectations of the business leaders. Navigating these professional relationships requires clear, concise communication and a firm grasp of who holds the formal versus informal power to facilitate project success. I look forward to discussing the intricacies of project initiation with you soon. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the development of the project charter and how it serves as the foundational authority for project initiation. Developing the project charter is a decisive moment in the life cycle of any project, as it effectively transitions an abstract business need into an authorized undertaking. This document acts as the formal instrument that grants a project manager the necessary authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. Without a charter, a project manager often finds themselves operating in a vacuum, lacking the mandate to command resources or make binding decisions. You should view the charter as a high-level contract between the project team and the sponsoring organization. It captures the essence of why the project exists, what it intends to achieve, and the boundaries within which the team must operate. By establishing these parameters early, you protect the project from scope creep and ensure that every team member understands the primary objectives. It is the document that provides the project manager with the power to start working, effectively grounding the project in reality. The input for a successful charter is rarely created from scratch by the project manager alone, as it typically relies on existing business documentation like the business case and feasibility studies. A business case outlines the economic justification for the project, demonstrating that the expected benefits outweigh the costs. If the business case is flawed, no amount of project management rigor can salvage the initiative's ultimate value. Feasibility studies further refine this by investigating technical, operational, and financial constraints that might impact the project's viability. When you integrate these inputs, you are essentially synthesizing strategic alignment into a manageable document. This is where you identify the high-level requirements that define what success looks like for the organization. By clarifying these requirements now, you prevent misalignment later in the process when technical details become more complex. Measurable objectives and success criteria represent the tangible benchmarks against which the project will be evaluated upon completion. These goals must be concrete and verifiable. A vague objective like improve efficiency is insufficient for a formal charter. Instead, you need clear definitions, such as reduce transaction processing time by 15% within 6 months. Success criteria are the specific standards that must be met to consider the project deliverables acceptable to stakeholders. You must also include a summary budget in this document to establish initial financial expectations and organizational commitment. While this budget is high level, it provides the baseline for the board or sponsor to track the project's financial trajectory. When stakeholders sign off on this document, they are formalizing their commitment to these constraints and the project's overarching vision. Managing initial constraints and high-level risks is another critical function of the charter development process. Every project exists within an environment of limitations, whether they are budgetary, temporal, or resource-related. By documenting these constraints early, you ensure the sponsor understands the trade-offs involved before the project gains momentum. High-level risks are the potential events that could derail the project before it even begins. You do not need a detailed register at this stage, but you must identify the primary threats to the project's existence. Acknowledging these risks early allows you to have mature conversations with stakeholders about feasibility and mitigation strategies. This honesty builds the trust necessary to sustain the project through more turbulent phases later on. The final step in this process is coordinating with the sponsor to secure formal approval and sign-off. This sign-off is more than an administrative formality. It is a pledge from the organization to support the project manager. When the sponsor signs the charter, they are publicly endorsing the project and providing the necessary organizational backing. This public authentication helps the project manager navigate internal politics and secure the cooperation of functional managers who control vital resources. You are essentially setting the initial vision that aligns everyone's expectations from the top down. If you lead this process effectively, you establish a clear boundary for what is in scope and, just as importantly, what is out of scope. Properly executed charters are the primary defense against the common failure modes of lack of direction and missing authorization. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to this chapter on stakeholder identification, where we will ensure your project remains aligned with the people who truly hold the power to shape its outcome. We will examine how a disciplined approach to identifying and classifying your project participants forms the bedrock of eventual success. In professional project management, a stakeholder is simply anyone who is positively or negatively impacted by the project or can influence its progression. Identifying these individuals and groups during the initiation phase is not merely an administrative checkbox. It is a critical strategic activity that defines the boundaries of your influence. Often, junior managers focus only on obvious stakeholders like the project sponsor or senior executives. But this narrow view leads to significant blind spots. You must look beyond the organizational chart to find individuals, such as affected department heads, local community leaders, or even internal regulatory compliance teams. If you fail to identify a key influencer early on, you will inevitably face unexpected resistance when you least expect it. By adopting a comprehensive mindset from the outset, you establish a structure where proactive management replaces reactive firefighting. This requires deliberate effort to look at the project ecosystem through the lens of those who have a vested interest in your results. Once you have established your initial list, you must classify these people based on their power, interest, and impact on your project. The most common tool for this is the power interest grid, which maps stakeholders into 4 distinct quadrants based on their ability to affect the project and their level of concern for its outcome. For instance, high power, high interest individuals are your key players who necessitate close, continuous engagement. Conversely, someone with high power but low interest requires only enough information to keep them satisfied, preventing them from becoming a source of disruption. You might also employ the salience model, which classifies stakeholders by their power, urgency, and legitimacy. This model is particularly effective when you have limited time and resources because it highlights who deserves your immediate attention. By using these frameworks, you move away from guesswork and toward an analytical approach to communication. This ensures you do not waste your limited energy on stakeholders who do not currently require personalized outreach. All of these insights must be synthesized into the stakeholder register, which is fundamentally a living document that persists throughout the project lifecycle. It is common for new stakeholders to emerge as the project evolves, while others may lose their interest or influence over time. You should treat this document as a dynamic repository of contact information, assessment data, and classification records that keeps your strategy current. Never assume that the register you create in the initiation phase will suffice for the duration of the project. A neglected register is a clear signal that the project manager is losing control of the environment. Instead, commit to reviewing and updating this registry at every major project milestone or when significant changes occur. This habit keeps your communication planning grounded in current reality rather than outdated assumptions. Managing stakeholder expectations also requires a deep understanding of the subtle cultural and political climate of your organization. Every company has hidden power structures, informal decision-making channels, and value systems that dictate how work truly gets done. You might propose an excellent, technically sound solution, only to see it rejected because it violates a long-standing cultural norm that you failed to account for. Take the time to observe how your organization handles conflict and where the true leverage points reside. It is often necessary to conduct quiet, one-on-one meetings to sense the level of buy-in or underlying skepticism regarding your project. By respecting these internal dynamics, you can navigate the political landscape more effectively and position your project to gain the necessary support. Always remember that internal politics are simply the unspoken rules of the road that you must learn to drive by. When it comes to early engagement, your objective is to gather diverse requirements while establishing rapport with stakeholders as soon as possible. Use this initial period to listen far more than you speak. Ask open-ended questions designed to surface hidden needs or constraints. This is the optimal time to identify potential resistance, as it is much easier to resolve concerns at this stage than after significant work is underway. If a stakeholder expresses doubts, treat their resistance as valuable data that reveals where your project plan needs refinement. Seek to understand the root cause of their anxiety, whether it is a fear of changing workflows or concerns about resource reallocation. Early resolution requires empathy and active negotiation, which helps build the foundational trust required for long-term project success. Finally, you must establish communication channels that reflect the distinct preferences and professional needs of your various stakeholder groups. Some executives will only ever want a concise summary dashboard, while technical team members might require deep dive discussions on specific design constraints. Providing information through the wrong medium is a common cause of poor stakeholder management. Consider the formal reporting requirements of the project while balancing them against the informal, real-time communication that keeps things moving efficiently. By asking your stakeholders how they prefer to receive information, you foster a collaborative environment that respects their workload. Well-defined communication channels prevent misunderstandings and ensure that decisions are based on accurate, shared information. Clear processes here reduce the overall administrative burden for everyone involved. I will see you in the next session. Welcome back. We are now shifting our focus toward the critical phase of defining what the project will actually deliver to the stakeholders. This chapter provides the foundational techniques required to elicit clear requirements and establish firm boundaries that ensure project success. Eliciting requirements is the bedrock of project scope management, yet it is often misunderstood as a simple act of asking stakeholders what they want. In reality, you must utilize a structured approach such as interviews, which allow for private, in-depth discussions with individuals who have specific domain knowledge. Focus groups are another powerful tool, as they bring multiple stakeholders together to capture diverse perspectives and identify inconsistencies in their expectations. Brainstorming, conversely, relies on a group setting to generate a vast array of creative ideas, although it requires a skilled facilitator to prevent participants from being inhibited by the presence of authority figures. Beyond these initial gathering techniques, you need to differentiate clearly between various types of requirements to maintain order in your documentation. Business requirements focus on the high-level needs of the organization, while stakeholder requirements capture the specific needs of individuals or groups, and solution requirements translate these into functional and non-functional specifications. By maintaining these boundaries, you prevent the common trap of conflating a stakeholder's personal desire with the actual business objective. Precision at this stage prevents the disastrous consequence of building an expensive solution that nobody actually needs or understands. Once you have gathered the raw material, the next step involves structuring it through the Requirements Traceability Matrix, or RTM. Think of the RTM as a roadmap that links every requirement back to its source, whether that source is the original business goal, a specific stakeholder, or a regulatory mandate. Without this explicit linkage, it becomes nearly impossible to defend why a specific feature was included or why another was omitted during the project lifecycle. When the team finds themselves debating if a specific technical task belongs in the project, the RTM serves as the objective source of truth to resolve that ambiguity. It fundamentally ensures that every unit of work performed by your team maps directly to a tangible business value. If you cannot trace a deliverable back to an approved requirement, that work is inherently suspicious and represents potential waste or unauthorized scope. By rigorously managing this matrix, you provide the transparency required to keep stakeholders aligned and to justify the project's resource consumption against its strategic objectives. The development of the project scope statement serves as the definitive boundary for your work, acting as a contract of sorts that informs all project participants. This document explicitly identifies what is included in the project, but more importantly, it defines what is explicitly excluded from the endeavor. By detailing out-of-scope items, you create a powerful defense against scope creep, which is the unmanaged and unauthorized expansion of project work. When stakeholders request additional features midstream, the scope statement acts as the primary tool for referring back to the original agreement. To refine the deliverables that reside within these boundaries, you should apply product analysis and alternative generation. Product analysis involves breaking down products into their constituent parts to evaluate the feasibility of the requirements. Alternatives generation forces the project team to look at different ways of achieving the goals, which often reveals more efficient or cost-effective ways to deliver value. Establishing a common understanding of these boundaries is not a one-time event, but a constant process of communication and verification throughout the project. See you in our next session. Welcome back. Today we are starting our focus on the work breakdown structure, a fundamental tool for successful project delivery. You will learn how to turn abstract project goals into concrete, actionable work packages that ensure your project stays on track and within budget. The work breakdown structure, often abbreviated as WBS, serves as the hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team. Its primary purpose is to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables by structuring the work into manageable components. By breaking the project down into smaller pieces, we transition from an overwhelming high-level vision to specific, assignable tasks. Think of this as the architectural blueprint for your project execution, where each level of decomposition provides increased detail about the project deliverables. Without this structural breakdown, the project scope remains a vague concept, making it nearly impossible to assign responsibility or estimate the required effort accurately. A well-constructed WBS is not merely a list of tasks. It is a vital visualization of all work that must be performed to meet the project requirements. Central to the integrity of any WBS is the 100% rule, which states that the sum of the work at the child levels must equal exactly 100% of the work represented by the parent levels. This rule essentially dictates that you cannot include work that lies outside the project scope within your WBS, nor can you omit essential tasks that are required to achieve the project objectives. When you decompose a main deliverable into subdeliverables, those subdeliverables must collectively encompass all the work necessary to produce the parent deliverable. If a task isn't in the WBS, it shouldn't exist in the project, as any unlisted work represents a scope creep risk that can derail your schedule and budget. Adhering to this principle forces the project manager to account for everything, creating a comprehensive map of the project's reality from the top down. Each terminal node in the WBS is known as a work package, which represents the lowest level for which cost and duration can be estimated and managed. It is common practice to assign a unique identifier, often called a code of accounts, to each work package to facilitate precise tracking and reporting. These codes provide a bridge between the project scope, the accounting system, and the project management information system. By having these identifiers in place, you establish a clear trail that links every expenditure and hour of work back to a specific node in the scope hierarchy. This system ensures that when you report on project progress, you're speaking a language understood by both the technical team and the financial controllers. Consistency in applying these unique labels is what differentiates a loose collection of tasks from a professional, manageable project structure. The WBS further mandates the creation of a WBS dictionary, a supplementary document that provides detailed information for each work package. While the WBS structure itself shows the relationship between components, the dictionary provides the necessary metadata, such as descriptions, resource requirements, and quality standards. This is where you document the specific criteria for completion because without a definition of done, you cannot confirm that a work package is truly finished. The dictionary clarifies ambiguous items and ensures that every stakeholder shares a common understanding of what constitutes a deliverable. It is the repository of granular information that would otherwise clutter the visual hierarchy of the WBS chart, keeping the structure itself clean while ensuring that the details remain accessible. Using the WBS as a foundation for cost and schedule estimation is perhaps the most practical application of this discipline in project management. Once the work is decomposed into manageable components, estimating the cost of each package becomes a matter of arithmetic rather than guesswork. You can derive the total budget by aggregating the costs of these individual components, which leads to a more defensible cost baseline. Similarly, the duration required for each work package informs the overall project schedule, allowing you to sequence work effectively based on realistic constraints. This structural approach transforms the project from a black box into a series of transparent, measurable entities that you can control. Beyond scope, the WBS serves as a natural precursor to the organizational breakdown structure, or OBS, which maps the work packages to the specific departments or project team members responsible for their completion. While the WBS focuses on what needs to be done, the OBS focuses on who is going to do it, facilitating a clear alignment between project deliverables and organizational accountability. By ensuring granular clarity during the planning phase, you reduce the likelihood of ambiguity and overlap, which are the primary drivers of scope creep. This, in turn, creates a stable foundation for the creation of accurate time and cost baselines that will serve you throughout the project lifecycle. When you integrate these elements, you move away from reactive, sporadic management toward a proactive stance based on structured control. See you in the next session. Welcome back to this exploration of project management fundamentals. In this module, we will focus on the essential practice of identifying and managing high-level risks during the initiating phase of a project. Risk management is often misunderstood as a task to be performed only once the project plan is fully baked, but this is a significant error. In reality, the most effective risk management begins as soon as the project charter is drafted. By identifying macro-level risks early, you prevent the project from being built on a flawed foundation. We typically start this process using a SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. While strengths and weaknesses often pertain to the internal capabilities of the organization, opportunities and threats look outward at the environment in which the project will operate. Engaging expert judgment is equally vital here, as seasoned professionals can often spot systemic vulnerabilities that are not immediately apparent to those closer to the daily grind. To identify these macro-level risks effectively, you must first understand the risk appetite of your organization and your primary stakeholders. Risk appetite is the level of uncertainty an entity is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals. It is rarely uniform across a company. For instance, a tech startup might have a high appetite for technical risk to achieve a faster market entry, while a regulated financial institution would logically favor a more conservative approach. You must document the assumptions and constraints that impact project feasibility early in the process. An assumption is a factor considered true without proof, while a constraint is a limiting factor that affects the project execution. Failing to identify that a specific regulation is a constraint or that a technological capability is merely an assumption often leads to downstream project failure that could have been avoided during initiation. Once you have identified these uncertainties, they must be recorded in a high-level risk register. This document serves as the primary instrument for tracking risks from day one, ensuring that awareness of these issues remains central to stakeholder discussions. It is important to remember that a risk is not inherently negative, as we must differentiate between threats and opportunities. A threat is an uncertain event that, if it occurs, has a negative effect on project objectives, while an opportunity is an uncertain event that, if it occurs, has a positive impact. By tracking both, a project manager ensures that the team is not only defending against failure, but also actively positioning the project to capture value when favorable conditions emerge. Strategies for risk mitigation in the initiating phase are fundamentally about prevention rather than reaction. The goal here is to establish a risk-aware culture where potential obstacles are communicated openly rather than hidden for fear of reprisal. You must align these strategies with the overall business objectives stipulated in the project charter. If the project charter insists on a rigid delivery date, any risk that implies a schedule slippage becomes a priority that must be addressed immediately. Conversely, if the business objective is to enter a new market, the risk of not identifying local compliance requirements should be weighted more heavily than minor budgetary fluctuations. By embedding these considerations into the initiation phase, you ensure that the high-level risks do not inadvertently undermine the viability of the project before it ever really begins. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will address the mechanics of creating a schedule management plan, which acts as the foundational blueprint for how your project timeline will be governed throughout its life cycle. Developing a schedule management plan is not merely about choosing software or setting dates, but rather about establishing the formal processes that dictate how the project schedule will be developed, executed, monitored, and controlled. You must explicitly document the criteria for developing and maintaining the schedule, as this document will serve as your primary guide when stakeholders inevitably ask about milestones or potential delays. Without a plan, you are effectively flying blind, making ad hoc decisions that often lead to scope creep or chaotic resource allocation. You should begin by defining the scheduling methodology, such as the critical path method or agile iterations, and the specific tools you will employ to manage these activities. Consider the maturity of your organization when selecting these tools, as an overly complex system can become a burden rather than an asset. Your plan must also define the level of accuracy and the units of measure for duration estimates, ensuring that everyone on the team interprets timeframes identically. Clear communication regarding these standards prevents the ambiguity that often plagues early project stages. By documenting these elements early, you align expectations between the project team and organizational leadership regarding how progress will be measured against the baseline. Defining activities is naturally the next step, where you decompose the work packages from your work breakdown structure into specific, actionable line items. Once those activities are identified, you must sequence them logically using the precedence diagramming method, or PDM, which allows you to visualize dependencies. You should pay close attention to the four primary logical relationships that dictate how work flows: finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and start to finish. A finish to start relationship is the most intuitive and common, where activity A must conclude before activity B begins, but real-world projects often necessitate more nuance. Leads and lags allow you to adjust these sequences. A lead can accelerate a successor activity, while a lag introduces a mandatory waiting period. Applying these correctly requires a deep understanding of the technical constraints and the external dependencies that might exist outside your control. If you ignore these constraints during the sequencing phase, your schedule will lack the structural integrity required to survive the project execution phase. You must ensure that every activity is logically linked to at least one successor and one predecessor, except for the initial and final project activities, to avoid dangling dependencies that break your network diagram. When it comes to estimation, you have several reliable techniques at your disposal, and choosing the right one depends largely on the information available at your disposal. Analogous estimation leverages historical data from similar past projects, offering a relatively quick but often less accurate way to estimate durations when you have limited details. When you have more granular data, parametric estimation uses statistical relationships, such as historical metrics per hour, to calculate estimated time, which provides a more scientific basis for your planning. However, for a more robust approach, the three-point estimation, or PERT, is invaluable because it incorporates optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely scenarios to calculate an expected duration. By calculating a weighted average, typically adding the optimistic for times the most likely and the pessimistic values before dividing by 6, you arrive at a statistically sound estimate. This helps you account for uncertainty directly within your schedule rather than relying on gut feeling, which is rarely a reliable project management tool. Practitioners who rely solely on single-point estimates often find themselves surprised by variance, whereas those who apply these techniques produce schedules with a much higher probability of success. Identifying the critical path is essential, as this path represents the longest sequence of activities that dictates the shortest possible time to complete your project. Any delay on the critical path directly impacts the project end date, meaning these activities require your constant, focused attention throughout the project execution. You must also calculate the total float, which is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without affecting the project completion date, and free float, which is the amount of time it can be delayed without affecting the start of a successor activity. Knowing the float for each activity allows you to make informed decisions about where to deploy extra resources if you fall behind schedule. For instance, activities with zero float have no flexibility and are automatically on the critical path, whereas those with significant float provide a buffer that can be sacrificed in dire situations. This mathematical rigor allows you to optimize your timeline by moving resources from activities with high float to those with zero float, effectively performing resource leveling or smoothing. Resource leveling often extends the project duration to resolve resource conflicts, whereas smoothing optimizes the use of resources without altering the critical path, provided there is slack available. Effective scheduling in practice also requires a firm grasp of how to baseline and manage change, especially in environments where predictability is not guaranteed. You must capture the schedule baseline, which serves as the approved version of the schedule against which actual progress will be measured throughout the project. Once this baseline is locked, any significant deviation must be handled through a formal change management process, ensuring that you do not inadvertently skew your project performance reporting. For hybrid projects, you must integrate traditional milestones with agile ceremonies like sprint planning, acknowledging the different cadence required for each. Define clear thresholds for variance reporting early on, as this tells the team exactly when a delay triggers an escalation to management. If you wait until a problem becomes a crisis to report on it, you lose the trust of stakeholders and the opportunity to rectify the situation proactively. A well-constructed schedule management plan provides this transparency, ensuring that everyone understands not only what needs to be done, but also the specific rules for how the team will operate when things do not go exactly according to the initial plan. See you in the next session. Welcome to our deep dive into cost management and budgeting, where we move from abstract scope definitions to the concrete financial reality of your project. By the end of this chapter, you will possess the precise technical skills required to draft, track, and defend project budgets with authority. Estimating costs effectively requires a decomposition process that mirrors your work breakdown structure, ensuring that no individual task is overlooked. We begin at the activity level, where base estimates for labor, materials, and equipment are calculated using techniques like analogous, parametric, or bottom-up estimation. As project managers, we aggregate these granular data points upward into the work package level to form the control accounts. This aggregation is not merely a summation, but a consolidation that allows for better roll-up reporting throughout the project lifecycle. You must ensure that your estimation methods are consistent across the project team to maintain data integrity. Accurate bottom-up estimates serve as the fundamental building blocks for the entire project budget. Without this disciplined approach to granular estimation, the higher-level figures become mere guesswork, which inevitably leads to financial instability during execution. By grounding your budget in verified activity costs, you establish a defensible framework that can withstand rigorous stakeholder scrutiny. Once you have established the base costs, you must address financial uncertainties through the strategic application of reserves. Contingency reserves are allocated for identified risks that exist within the project scope, often referred to as known unknowns. You should manage these reserves as part of the cost baseline, as they reside under your direct control as the project manager. In contrast, management reserves are held for unforeseen risks or scope changes that fall outside the current project plan, often termed unknown unknowns. Management reserves are not included in the performance measurement baseline, but remain part of the overall project budget. Misunderstanding the distinction between these two types of reserves frequently leads to under-budgeting and premature project failure. Always document the rationale for your contingency drawdowns to ensure transparency with stakeholders when risks transition into active issues. Maintaining this separation of funds allows you to maintain a realistic baseline while keeping a safety net for genuine emergencies. Developing the cost baseline is the critical step that integrates your time-phase budget with the project schedule. This baseline provides the authorized time-phased budget used to measure, monitor, and control the overall cost performance of the project. We visualize this progression through the S-curve, a graph that plots the cumulative costs against time to show how spending accelerates and levels off. If you notice that your actual expenditure curve deviates significantly from this S-curve, you have an immediate visual indicator of potential performance trouble. The S-curve essentially acts as an early warning system, allowing you to identify variances before they consume your remaining budget. By comparing planned progress against actual costs, you can determine if you're getting the intended value for the resources consumed. This structured approach to visualization is essential for communicating the project's health to senior management during steering committee briefings. Financial management extends beyond the cost baseline into the realm of funding limit reconciliation to ensure your spending stays aligned with organizational cash flow. Projects rarely operate in an environment of unlimited liquidity, meaning you must often adjust your task sequencing to keep actual expenditures within defined funding bounds. If the project requires more cash than the organization can provide at a specific phase, you must reconcile the schedule with the available funds. This might require delaying non-critical tasks or optimizing resource consumption to shift peak spending periods. Integrating your costs with resource planning is equally vital, as labor usually represents the largest variable expense. Procurement planning must also be synchronized, as external vendor contracts require specific payment triggers that must be accounted for in your cash flow projections. A robust cost plan that ignores these constraints is often functionally useless in a real-world enterprise setting. You must define clear thresholds for cost variance to determine when corrective actions are officially triggered. These guidelines prevent minor, temporary fluctuations from distracting the team while ensuring that major slips receive immediate attention. When a cost variance exceeds your defined threshold, it mandates an analysis to identify the root cause, whether it is productivity issues, scope creep, or external price hikes. Establishing these triggers early in the planning phase allows you to act systematically rather than emotionally when the project faces financial pressure. You will find that these quantitative management processes reduce ambiguity and define the boundaries of your authority. By formalizing these governance rules, you establish an objective atmosphere where decisions are based on data rather than hearsay. Success in cost management requires balancing this rigorous analytical approach with the pragmatic realities of the business environment. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will establish the foundations of quality management and resource allocation for your project. Quality management is rarely about inspecting a final product at the end of a life cycle. It is about building the right processes from the beginning. You must create a quality management plan that defines the specific standards and metrics required to satisfy project stakeholders. This document acts as your compass, ensuring that the team understands what constitutes an acceptable outcome before production begins. For example, if you're building an API, your quality standard might involve a specific latency threshold or a mandatory pass rate for unit tests. To track these metrics, you can utilize tools like Pareto diagrams to visualize the most frequent sources of defects. Flowcharts help in mapping the process steps to identify where errors typically creep in, while checklists serve as basic verification tools to ensure that critical tasks are not overlooked. By applying these methods, you transition from subjective expectations to objective measurements that can be audited and improved. It is vital to distinguish between quality assurance and quality control, as these terms are often misused in professional settings. Quality assurance is fundamentally a process-oriented activity that focuses on preventing defects by improving the methods used to create deliverables. You might conduct a process audit to see if the development team is adhering to the established coding standards or project lifecycle phases. Conversely, quality control is a product-oriented activity that focuses on identifying defects in the work products that have already been generated. This happens through inspections, testing, and deliverable reviews against the established quality criteria. Essentially, if you're auditing your process to make sure the work is being done correctly, you are performing quality assurance. If you are examining a specific result to see if it meets the requirements, you are performing quality control. Resource planning is the exercise of determining which physical assets and team members are necessary to execute the project scope effectively. This begins with the development of a resource management plan, which outlines how resources will be categorized, allocated, and released throughout the project. Simultaneously, you should develop a team charter to establish the ground rules for behavior, communication, and decision-making within a group. A common and highly effective tool for resource clarity is the responsibility assignment matrix, specifically the RACI chart. By mapping roles to the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed categories, you eliminate ambiguity regarding who should perform the work and who has the final authority. This structure is particularly beneficial when managing virtual teams or cross-functional groups where reporting lines might be fragmented. Managing resources requires a constant balancing act against the constraints of your schedule and the defined quality requirements. If you assign highly specialized resources to trivial tasks, you increase costs and risk project burnout. Yet if you underspecify the skills required, your quality metrics will inevitably suffer. When dealing with cross-functional allocation, you must negotiate with functional managers to ensure that your project receives the necessary time from key personnel. Virtual teams require additional planning regarding time zones and communication protocols to avoid project drift. You should also consider the impact of resource constraints on the schedule. If a critical resource becomes unavailable, your quality assurance efforts may be delayed, creating a compounding effect on project delivery. Success in this domain depends on your ability to integrate these physical and human resources into a coherent plan that respects both the timeline and the qualitative goals of the project. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Here we begin our exploration into the communication management plan and the stakeholder engagement plan. In this session, We will examine the mechanics of information distribution and the strategic management of stakeholder interests to ensure project success. The Communication Management Plan acts as the foundational document for how information flows throughout the project lifecycle. It is not merely a list of meetings, but a structured approach to defining frequency, format, and sensitivity of the data being shared. When you design this plan, you must account for the specific needs of diverse stakeholders who may have vastly different requirements for technical detail versus high-level status updates. For instance, an executive sponsor likely requires a concise, visual dashboard focusing on milestones and budget health, whereas a technical lead needs granular data regarding task dependencies and resource utilization. We must also address the logistics of global teams by considering time, zone offsets, and linguistic nuances. By formalizing these expectations early, you eliminate the assumption that information is being received just because it has been sent. This proactive stance ensures that the right information reaches the right person at the right time in a format that promotes actionable understanding. At the core of these communications lies the encoder-decoder model, which illustrates how a message originates, is packaged, and eventually reaches its target. The sender encodes information into a medium, which the receiver then decodes. But this process is rarely perfect due to the presence of noise. Noise refers to any interference that distorts the meaning of the message during transmission, such as cultural differences, technological lag, or even the sheer complexity of the subject matter. To mitigate these risks, we implement feedback loops that allow the receiver to acknowledge receipt and verify comprehension. Without these loops, you operate in a vacuum where silence can be misinterpreted as agreement. We must consciously plan for these mechanisms, as they serve as the primary defensive strategy against misalignment. Understanding this model helps you realize that your primary job as a project manager is not just to talk, but to ensure the original intent is preserved throughout the transmission. While communication is about the flow of information, the stakeholder engagement plan is about managing the psychological and political relationship with those who impact your project. The primary goal here is to identify where each stakeholder currently stands versus where they need to be to ensure project success. We map these individuals across a spectrum ranging from resistant or unaware to supportive or leading. Your strategy should focus on transitioning stakeholders from their current engagement level to the desired state without creating friction. This often requires tailoring your approach based on individual influence and interest. A high-influence, low-interest stakeholder might only require periodic monitoring to prevent them from becoming an obstacle, while a high-influence, high-engagement stakeholder requires a more collaborative, hands-on relationship. Maintaining buy-in is a continuous process that depends on consistently meeting expectations and demonstrating the value of the project to their specific interests. Managing difficult stakeholders remains one of the most intellectually demanding aspects of our craft. When you encounter active resistance, it is rarely purely personal. It is usually driven by competing priorities, fear of change, or a lack of clarity regarding the project benefits. Instead of reacting defensively, you must investigate the root cause of the opposition through empathetic listening and objective analysis. By involving these stakeholders in problem solving or seeking their expertise on manageable components, you can often convert a challenger into a proponent. This transition is not about manipulation, but about alignment of goals. Regularly reviewing your engagement strategies allows you to adjust your tactics as project circumstances change. If a supporter becomes disinterested due to a change in project scope, your plan should be agile enough to capture that shift early. These strategies ensure that you remain in control of the project narrative even when facing significant political challenges within the organization. Effective reporting mechanisms provide the objective data needed to keep stakeholders informed and invested. These reports should be consistent and transparent, serving as a reliable heartbeat for the project's health. We incorporate formal reporting cycles into the communication plan to ensure that status tracking is never an afterthought. When you report on a project, prioritize clarity over volume. A document that is too long will rarely be fully read, leading to missed insights. Ensure that all reports align with the format established in your planning phase, whether that is a standard status report, a risk register update, or a financial summary. This consistency builds trust and reduces the cognitive load on stakeholders tasked with overseeing multiple initiatives. By institutionalizing these reporting mechanisms, you create a shared reality that holds the project team accountable and keeps the stakeholders anchored in current project performance. See you in the next session. Welcome to this in-depth look at advanced risk management strategies, where we move beyond high-level identification to rigorous, data-driven analysis. In this session, we will dissect the methodologies required to transform abstract threats into actionable project intelligence. Qualitative risk analysis serves as the primary filter for prioritizing project uncertainties based on their relative impact and probability. By utilizing a probability and impact matrix, project managers quantify risks to distinguish between those that demand immediate resources and those that warrant simple observation. This process relies heavily on historical data and expert judgment to assign scores that make the subjective more manageable. When we map risks onto a matrix, the goal is to create a clear visual hierarchy that informs the project team where to focus their limited bandwidth. It is important to remember that this process is iterative, as the perceived severity of a risk often changes as the project environment evolves. While qualitative analysis provides essential direction, it remains a heuristic tool that helps us rank risks without necessarily defining precise financial or temporal variances. Consequently, we must ensure these ratings are transparently documented to avoid bias skewed by overly optimistic stakeholders. Quantitative risk analysis takes over where qualitative methods end, providing a numerical assessment of project outcomes. Techniques such as Monte Carlo simulations allow us to model various outcomes by running thousands of iterations based on variable inputs, ultimately producing a probability distribution of project goals like completion dates or total costs. Decision tree analysis further refines this by quantifying the expected monetary value of different paths, which is particularly useful when choosing between alternative project strategies. These tools reduce uncertainty by replacing intuition with statistical modeling, giving management a clearer picture of their exposure. While these methods are powerful, they require high-quality data to be effective, as inaccurate inputs consistently lead to misleading outputs. For project manager, mastering these calculations means being able to articulate the specific financial impact of a risk rather than just stating that a risk is high priority. By grounding our decisions in numerical evidence, we gain much greater credibility when proposing contingency budgets or timeline adjustments. Developing effective risk response strategies requires a precise understanding of the options available for both threats and opportunities. We often classify these responses into 5 distinct categories: avoid, transfer, mitigate, accept, and escalate. Avoiding a threat involves changing the plan to eliminate the risk entirely, while transferring it shifts the impact to a third party, such as through insurance or fixed-price contracts. Mitigation focuses on proactively reducing the probability or impact to an acceptable level, whereas acceptance acknowledges the risk exists and involves preparing a fallback plan should the threat manifest. Escalation is reserved for risks that fall outside the project manager's authority, moving the responsibility up to a higher level of management. It is just as critical to address positive risks, known as opportunities, through strategies like exploit, share, enhance, or accept. Each of these tactical choices must be weighed against cost, schedule constraints, and the overall objectives of the organizational strategy. The foundation of this entire process is the risk management plan, which acts as the governing document for how risks are identified, analyzed, and controlled. It defines the methodologies, roles, and responsibilities, and sets the thresholds for what constitutes an acceptable level of risk exposure. Within the risk register, you must document not only the risks themselves, but also the specific triggers that indicate a risk is about to occur. These triggers act as early warning signals, prompting the activation of contingency plans, which are pre-authorized responses designed to address risks if they materialize. Without a robust risk management plan, project teams often find themselves reacting chaotically to issues that could have been managed systematically. Consistency in reporting and tracking is essential, as the risk register should be a living document that undergoes frequent reviews by the stakeholders. This institutionalizes the management of uncertainty, ensuring it is a standard part of every project lifecycle rather than an afterthought. As we implement our responses, we must remain vigilant regarding secondary and residual risks that often emerge from these actions. A secondary risk is a new threat that appears as a direct result of implementing a risk response, forcing us to constantly reevaluate our tactical chessboard. Residual risks are the portions of the original threats that remain after response measures have been taken, and these require continuous monitoring to ensure they do not exceed project tolerances. Successful risk management is not a one-time event, but a continuous process integrated into every daily stand-up and milestone review. We monitor these risks to verify if response strategies are effectively reducing uncertainty as intended or if adjustments are necessary to safeguard project success. By maintaining this level of oversight, we ensure the team remains resilient, objective, and prepared to handle whatever volatility the project environment presents. I look forward to discussing the next topic with you shortly. Hello, and welcome back. Today, we turn our attention toward the pivotal intersection of procurement strategy and holistic project integration. This chapter provides you with the essential architectural blueprints required to harmonize external resource acquisition with your internal project objectives, ensuring you pass the PMP exam. When we arrive at procurement planning, the primary task is to determine whether to perform work internally or to acquire services from external vendor. The make or buy decision is not merely a financial calculation, but a strategic assessment of your organization's core competencies, market availability, and risk tolerance. If an organization lacks the specialized equipment or the internal expertise to execute a project component, outsourcing becomes a logical necessity. However, you must carefully weigh the loss of direct control against the potential benefits of speed, cost efficiency, or access to proprietary knowledge. Once you decide to buy, the contract type establishes the risk distribution between the buyer and the seller. A fixed-price contract shifts most of the risk to the seller, as they must deliver a defined scope for a set price, which is ideal when project requirements are clear and unlikely to change. Conversely, cost reimbursable contracts are preferred when the scope is fluid or complex. Here, the buyer absorbs the risk by paying the seller for legitimate costs plus a fee. Time and materials contracts represent a hybrid approach, suitable for staff augmentation or projects where the effort required cannot be clearly estimated upfront. To facilitate these acquisitions, you must develop a thorough procurement management plan and define a clear statement of work. The procurement management plan details the procurement strategy, including the specific contract types, the process for selecting sellers, and the metrics used to evaluate vendor performance. The statement of work is arguably the most critical document in this process, as it describes the procurement item in sufficient detail to allow prospective sellers to determine if they can provide the required products or services. A well-written statement of work defines the project objectives, the specific tasks to be performed, and the technical requirements, leaving little room for conflicting interpretations. If the SOW is vague, you invite disputes and cost overruns because the seller will inevitably define the work differently than the buyer intended. Your task is to ensure the SOW is outcome-oriented while providing enough constraints to maintain the necessary quality standards. By aligning these documents with your broader organizational policies, you establish a governance framework that protects the interests of your stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle. Integration planning acts as the glue that holds these disparate procurement, scope, and cost management components together into a singular, executable project management plan. You cannot manage a project in fragments. Instead, you must ensure that every subsidiary plan, from communications to risk management, shares a unified trajectory. Finalizing the document involves verifying that the baselines for schedule, cost, and scope are mutually compatible and approved by the appropriate authorities. This integration process is not a point-in-time activity, but a continuous exercise in validating that change management processes are properly defined. Configuration management plays a vital role here, as it establishes the system for identifying, documenting, and controlling the characteristics of your project deliverables. Without a rigorous configuration management plan, versions of requirements or technical specifications can drift, leading to catastrophic misalignments during execution. By synchronizing every detail, you reach the state of a cohesive roadmap, which is the prerequisite for moving from the planning phase into actual work delivery. The culmination of this planning effort is the project kickoff meeting, which serves as the formal transition from planning to execution. This meeting should not be viewed as a mere administrative formality. It is a critical opportunity to align stakeholders, build team cohesion, and communicate the project vision. During the kickoff, you present the finalized project management plan to ensure that all parties have a shared understanding of their roles, responsibilities, and the project's success criteria. This is the moment where enthusiasm is converted into actionable commitment, and it is here that you confirm that the project's objectives are fully understood. You must use this time to reiterate the change management processes, ensuring everyone knows exactly how to escalate issues or request modifications to the scope. By facilitating this alignment, you reduce the likelihood of resistance later and set the standard for a transparent, well-communicated project culture. A successful kickoff meeting creates the necessary momentum. It clears the fog of uncertainty and ensures that the entire project team begins the execution phase with clarity and purpose. I look forward to discussing how we can translate these plans into results in our subsequent sessions. Welcome back as we transition from the theoretical planning stages into the core process of actually getting things done. In this chapter, we will master the art of executing the project management plan to transform intent into tangible results. Directing and managing project work is, in many ways, the heartbeat of the project management lifecycle. This process is where the project management plan transitions from a set of static documents into active execution, requiring you to lead the team in producing deliverables. You're no longer just theorizing about resources or schedules, but are now actively coordinating the technical and interpersonal work required to meet objectives. This requires a balanced approach to oversight where you ensure that the technical work proceeds according to specifications while simultaneously managing the human element that fuels that work. It is easy to get caught up in the technical minutiae, yet your primary duty is to keep the project moving forward by integrating approved changes and addressing corrective actions as they arise. You act as the facilitator, providing the necessary infrastructure, tools, and environmental support for the team to perform at their best. Think of yourself as the conductor of a complex orchestra where your input determines whether the output meets the quality standards defined during the planning phases. Without this layer of active direction, tasks drift, scope creep settles into the workflow, and the project loses its alignment with the initial vision. A significant component of this process is the utilization of a project management information system, or PMIS. In any modern organization, you cannot rely on manual tracking or disparate spreadsheets to manage thousands of data points or complex task interdependencies. The PMIS serves as the single source of truth, facilitating the collection, integration, and dissemination of information across the team. By automating data collection, you reduce the administrative burden on your team members, allowing them to focus on the value-added work that actually drives the project forward. This system integration also ensures that when you report on project health, your metrics reflect the current reality rather than outdated projections. Furthermore, the PMIS acts as a historical record, capturing performance data that becomes invaluable for later analysis and reporting. You must ensure that the team is trained on these tools. Otherwise, the system becomes a source of frustration rather than a catalyst for efficiency. A well-maintained PMIS provides the transparency required to hold stakeholders accountable and to provide accurate status updates without confusion or delay. Knowledge management is equally critical during this phase, often serving as the differentiator between a stagnant team and a learning organization. You're tasked with managing both explicit knowledge, such as technical documentation or specifications, and tacit knowledge, which resides in the minds of your team members. This is why facilitating status updates and regular team meetings is not just an administrative chore. It is a vital mechanism for surfacing challenges that might not be documented in a dashboard. You must actively foster an environment where people feel comfortable sharing what they have learned, especially when a particular approach did not work as expected. These insights should be captured in a lessons learned repository, which serves as a foundation for continuous improvement throughout the remainder of the project. If you fail to solicit this feedback, you doom the organization to repeat the same mistakes in the future. Tacit knowledge sharing happens most effectively in the spaces between formal meetings, so your job involves creating opportunities for that organic exchange of ideas to occur. Effectively managing project work also means navigating the reality of environmental factors and team dynamics during the most intense project phases. When the pressure mounts and the schedule tightens, even the most cohesive teams can experience friction or stress. Your role is to provide stability by maintaining the workflow, which often involves shielding your team from unnecessary distractions or shifting external priorities. You must be prepared to implement approved changes, as these are almost always necessary when the project meets the real world. A change is not a failure of planning, but a normal part of adjusting the project course to ensure it remains viable. By establishing a clear process for handling these adjustments, you prevent the project from becoming chaotic or reactive. You must ensure that every corrective action you implement is tracked and evaluated against the original objectives to verify that the fix actually solves the problem without introducing new risks. This degree of control requires a firm hand, clear communication, and an unwavering commitment to the quality specifications established at the project's inception. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter, where we will examine the intersection of quality assurance and the cultivation of human knowledge within your project. We are moving beyond mere checklists and into the systematic methodologies that ensure project excellence and institutional learning. In this chapter, we focus on the actionable steps required to ensure that your project processes remain robust and that your team acts as a cohesive learning entity. Delivering quality is not simply about inspecting a finished product, but about verifying that the processes used to build that product are disciplined and compliant. We will discuss how to implement quality audits to identify gaps between intended workflows and actual execution, which allows for evidence-based process improvements. By grounding our execution in the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, we turn abstract quality goals into a repeatable, scientific approach to project management. The PMP exam expects you to demonstrate a proactive stance, where identifying process failures early prevents the accumulation of technical debt or rework. This is the difference between a project manager who reacts to defects and one who designs a system that inherently produces results meeting defined standards before the final control quality phase begins. Managing knowledge is arguably the most undervalued competency in project management, yet it remains a critical pillar of both agility and process maturity. We distinguish between explicit knowledge, which is easily codified in documents or databases, and tacit knowledge, which resides in the minds and experiences of your team members. Effectively managing the former involves maintaining accurate repositories, but the latter requires an environment where information flows socially and organically. We will explore how to facilitate workshops and knowledge-sharing sessions that encourage team members to externalize their insights, thereby reducing reliance on specific individuals and mitigating the risks associated with team turnover. By focusing on these activities, you foster a culture of reflection rather than just a culture of production, which is essential for scaling performance across complex portfolios. A cornerstone of this process is the proactive management of a lessons learned register, a living document that must be updated in real time. Wait until the end of a project to document what went wrong, and you have lost the ability to apply those insights to your current iteration. Instead, we advocate for capturing insights during every phase of execution, ensuring that the team reflects on both successes and failures as part of their regular cadence. This register serves as the primary mechanism for institutionalizing change, providing a documented trail for quality improvements that survive beyond the project lifecycle. When you integrate these updates into your meeting structures, you normalize the behavior of improvement, making it a standard project process rather than an administrative burden. Before we move to the next section, let us consider how these concepts apply to daily project execution. When you facilitate a workshop, you are actively performing the dual role of a communicator and a quality gatekeeper. You are confirming that the team understands the project standards while simultaneously identifying where the organization's knowledge base might be insufficient. This holistic approach ensures that when your team reaches the control quality phase, the deliverables are already aligned with expectation, leaving only the final verification rather than extensive corrective rework. Master these techniques, and you elevate yourself from a project coordinator to a project architect. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back. And today we turn our attention to the human element of project management by examining how to acquire and develop your team effectively. We will cover the mechanics of securing resources, the evolution of group dynamics, and the strategies for maintaining high performance throughout the project lifecycle. Securing the right talent is the foundational step in any project, whether you're pulling from internal departments or looking toward external contractors. Negotiation is your primary instrument here, as you must often persuade functional managers to release their best employees for your project objectives. Pre-assignment occurs when specific individuals are identified during the project charter or proposal phase, often due to their unique expertise or prior commitments. You must clearly define these resource requirements early to avoid common bottlenecks during the execution phase. When dealing with external resources, the procurement process becomes an extension of acquisition, requiring rigorous vetting to ensure quality and compliance. Every interaction during this phase acts as a contract negotiation, where you balance project constraints against the availability and cost of specialized human capital. Effective acquisition requires a transparent understanding of the skills required to meet project deliverables and a willingness to advocate for those resources. Once your team is assembled, they will inevitably pass through distinct stages of group development, a concept formally captured by the Tuckman ladder. You should anticipate a forming stage, where team members are polite but cautious as they understand their roles and project goals. This leads to the storming phase, which is marked by inevitable conflict as personalities clash and work habits are challenged. As a project manager, you must facilitate the transition into the norming stage, where the team begins to operate as a coherent, productive unit that understands its shared purpose. The ultimate goal is the performing phase, where the team is self-organized, reliable, and capable of solving complex problems without constant intervention. Eventually, the project ends, and you will guide the team through the adjourning stage, ensuring that their work is recognized and that the transition to future projects is handled with dignity and professionalism. Building a functional team often requires bridging skill gaps through targeted training and clear expectations set within a team charter. This living document acts as a social and operational contract, defining communication protocols, decision-making processes, and the team values that will govern daily interactions. By formalizing these norms early, you reduce ambiguity and provide a framework that fosters psychological safety, allowing team members to voice concerns without fear of reprisal. Skill gaps should be treated as opportunities for professional growth rather than as performance failures. You might implement cross-training, structured workshops, or peer mentoring sessions to ensure that the team is resilient and that single points of failure are minimized. A team that feels supported in their professional development is consistently more committed to the overall project success and more willing to innovate under pressure. Recognition and reward systems remain potent tools for maintaining motivation throughout the project lifecycle under the condition that they are aligned with team objectives. Effective rewards do not always look like financial incentives, as public acknowledgement, professional recognition, and growth opportunities often provide longer-lasting morale boosts. In the context of virtual teams and a global workforce, you must be particularly intentional about how you distribute these rewards to ensure inclusivity across different time zones and cultures. Logistics for remote work involve selecting the right suite of collaboration tools and establishing a cadence that respects work-life boundaries while maintaining synchronous connection. Managing a distributed team requires extra effort in communication to compensate for the lack of physical presence, particularly in maintaining a collaborative culture. Conflict resolution in these environments relies heavily on negotiation techniques and neutral mediation, ensuring that disagreements are settled before they spiral into systemic project issues. High performance is rarely the result of chance. It is the product of sustained effort in culture building and consistent management practice. You act as the facilitator, protecting the team from organizational noise and ensuring that they have the environment necessary to perform their specialized tasks. By emphasizing transparency, clear accountability, and emotional intelligence, you create an atmosphere where high-achieving individuals can collaborate effectively. Keep in mind that interpersonal friction is a natural byproduct of a high-stakes environment, and your role is to address it objectively rather than ignoring it or over-controlling the participants. Mastery of these human-centric skills is just as essential for your PMP certification as your ability to perform complex schedule calculations. The focus must always remain on enabling the team to deliver value through structured development and disciplined, empathetic leadership. See you in the next session. Welcome back. We are now turning our focus to the practical realities of managing communications and stakeholder engagement during project execution. In this lesson, we will shift from the theoretical plans we created earlier toward the actual implementation of communication strategies and the nuanced work of managing stakeholder relationships. Many project managers make the mistake of assuming that a well-documented plan is sufficient to achieve project success, forgetting that information distribution is a social process as much as a technical one. When we distribute reports or communicate project updates, we are not merely pushing data, we are managing the perception of the project's health and trajectory. Consistent, transparent reporting prevents the formation of information vacuums where rumors and misalignment tend to thrive. It is therefore vital to ensure that the content of your communications is not only accurate, but also tailored to the specific needs of your audience, whether that is a technical team requiring granular detail or an executive sponsor needing a high-level summary. By maintaining this discipline, you build a baseline of trust that proves invaluable when the project eventually encounters inevitable challenges or delays. Managing stakeholder expectations requires a shift in mindset from simple reporting to active engagement through listening and conflict resolution. When a stakeholder expresses a concern or voices a disagreement regarding project progress, it is easy to default to a defensive posture or to dismiss the input as an obstacle to the current plan. Instead, you must practice active listening to uncover the underlying interest or need that drives their reaction, as this often reveals risks that were not fully captured during the initial identification phase. Conflict is inevitable in any project of significant scope, but your goal is not to eliminate it entirely. Rather, it is to resolve it before it escalates into a project stalling issue. This often involves negotiating compromises that satisfy the core objectives of the project while acknowledging the legitimate constraints or priorities of the stakeholder. By framing these interactions around shared goals, you transform potential antagonists into collaborators who feel adequately represented in the decision-making process. The efficacy of your communication strategy is heavily dependent on your ability to utilize emotional intelligence to influence and guide the team. Emotional intelligence allows a project manager to recognize the emotional state of team members and adjust their communication style to provide support or, conversely, to drive accountability. When the team feels stressed by tight deadlines or complex technical hurdles, a calm and methodical delivery of information acts as a stabilizing force that prevents burnout and maintains focus. Furthermore, your ability to influence stakeholders often depends on your credibility, which is built on the foundation of emotional self-regulation and empathy. If you can anticipate how a specific message might be received, you can craft its delivery to minimize friction and maximize the likelihood of the desired outcome. This skill set is what allows a project manager to move beyond the administration of the project and toward the true leadership of the human elements involved. Facilitating meetings effectively remains the most direct way to drive collaborative decision-making and ensure that all necessary stakeholders remain aligned. A meeting without a clear purpose or an agenda that respects the attendees' limited time is essentially a drain on project productivity and a source of irritation for stakeholders. You should strive to facilitate these sessions strictly, ensuring that the dialogue stays focused on the project objectives while providing a structured venue for necessary input. Whenever you reach a point where a decision must be made, ensure that the process is transparent and that you have documented the rationale behind the chosen course of action. When stakeholders feel that their time is respected and their contributions directly impact the project outcomes, their commitment to the final decision increases substantially. Always remember that transparency regarding project status, even when that status is unfavorable, is a critical component of professional project management that preserves your integrity as a leader. When issues emerge during the execution phase, they must be tracked and addressed through a formal, documented process known as the issue log. An issue is essentially a problem that has already occurred, as opposed to a risk, which is a potential event that might happen in the future. By maintaining a living issue log, you demonstrate a commitment to accountability and provide a clear history of how obstacles were encountered and subsequently navigated. This adds another layer of transparency to your management style, as stakeholders can see that you are proactively managing the project health rather than attempting to hide shortcomings. It also helps manage stakeholder expectations by keeping them informed of the specific actions being taken to resolve issues, thereby reducing the anxiety that often occurs when the project trajectory shifts unexpectedly. Keeping this log current is not merely an administrative requirement. It is a vital tool for maintaining control and ensuring that no significant disruption goes unaddressed. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanics of conducting procurements and the rigorous process of selecting capable sellers for your project. Selecting the right vendor is rarely a matter of picking the lowest bid, but rather a strategic alignment of capabilities with your project needs. We begin by broadcasting our requirements through advertising, a step that serves as an essential filter to attract potential sellers who possess the necessary qualifications and capacity. This phase demands clarity. If your advertised requirements are ambiguous, You invite responses from unqualified entities, which ultimately wastes your evaluation time. Once interested parties come forward, the bidder conference becomes the primary mechanism for leveling the playing field. During this meeting, it is imperative to address questions from all potential vendors simultaneously to ensure that no single bidder gains an informational advantage. You must meticulously document every question and answer provided during these conferences and distribute this information to every interested party with the same level of transparency. This ensures that when proposals arrive, they are based on an identical understanding of the project's technical specifications and quality constraints. When it comes to selecting a seller, the subjective nature of human judgment is a significant risk factor that we must mitigate with structured decision-making tools. We use weighted criteria and selection matrices to quantify what are often qualitative assessments of a vendor's past performance, technical approach, and pricing. You assign weights to these criteria based on their respective importance to the success of the project, ensuring that the most critical requirements, such as specialized technical expertise or adherence to strict regulatory standards, carry the most influence in the final score. This mathematical approach forces a dispassionate evaluation, preventing decisions based on personal biases or vendor relationships. It is also the phase where you apply professional judgment to assess whether a bidder's promise of performance is realistic or whether it represents an overly aggressive bid aimed at winning the contract at the cost of later project failure. Your goal is to maximize value, which encompasses not just cost, but the probability of project success through competent delivery. Negotiation is the stage where the abstract requirements of a proposal transform into a binding legal commitment. You're not searching for a winner in a zero-sum game, but rather seeking a mutual agreement that balances vendor profitability with your project's delivery objectives. A well-constructed contract must explicitly reflect the technical and quality requirements discussed earlier, leaving no room for assumptions that could later lead to scope creep or disputes. During this process, you must ensure full legal and organizational compliance, verifying that the terms adhere to your company's procurement policies and the prevailing laws of the jurisdiction. Once the contract is signed, the relationship enters the integration phase, which is frequently underestimated by project managers. You must establish clear protocols for how the vendor's deliverables will be woven into your existing workflow, which involves defining communication cadences, review cycles, and handoff procedures that maintain the continuity of your project. Managing third-party vendors requires an active, ongoing effort rather than a passive wait for deliverables to arrive. Expectations must be managed from the inception of the contract, explicitly detailing the project's quality standards so that the vendor understands how their output will be measured and controlled. If you find yourself in a situation where a vendor struggles to meet a technical requirement, it often points to a failure in the initial procurement communication rather than a failure of the vendor's intent. You must facilitate a cooperative environment where their expertise is treated as a component of your own project team, provided it is properly aligned with your project's governance framework. Regular oversight, combined with a clear understanding of the project's overall context, allows for early detection of potential risks. When you maintain this level of control and transparency, the integration of external deliverables becomes a seamless extension of your project management office's capabilities. I will see you in the next session. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanics of executing risk responses and how to integrate these actions within a formal change control process. Risk management is often misunderstood as a purely analytical phase that concludes once the plan is finalized, but in practice is a continuous operational discipline. When a risk trigger, a predetermined signal that a risk is about to emerge or has occurred, is tripped, the project manager must shift from passive monitoring to active deployment of the response strategy. This is not the moment to convene extensive committee meetings to wonder why the risk occurred, but rather the execution of the contingency plan you previously defined. If your risk register identifies a potential supply chain delay as a significant threat, and that trigger occurs, your team should immediately execute the pre-approved workaround. This relies heavily on the quality of your planning, as an unpracticed response in a high-pressure environment is rarely effective and often introduces more chaos. Managing unplanned issues requires a distinct mental model from addressing identified risks, as issues by definition have already materialized and lack the benefit of a pre-planned strategy. When an unforeseen problem surfaces, the integrated change control process acts as your primary mechanism for maintaining the project's structural integrity. You must evaluate the impact of this issue across all knowledge areas, specifically looking at how your proposed resolution affects the triple constraint of scope, schedule, and cost. If a change to the technical baseline is required to mitigate the issue, you must document the request formally. This ensures that no individual team member, however well-intentioned, unilaterally modifies the project deliverables without considering the ripple effects on other project areas. Maintaining agility in the face of materialized risks is a delicate balancing act that distinguishes high-performing project managers from those who struggle with rigidity. Agility requires that your team remains informed about the risk thresholds and empowered to flag potential triggers early, without fear of retribution for bringing bad news. Conversely, you must prevent the development of a reactive culture where every minor deviation results in a complete abandonment of the baseline. When a risk response is implemented, it often necessitates a deviation from the original plan, which might require a formal change request if the baseline is significantly impacted. By keeping stakeholders informed during these transitions, you provide the necessary transparency that maintains trust even when the project trajectory shifts due to external pressures. Documentation of these occurrences is not merely a bureaucratic requirement, but an essential component of organizational process assets. Once a risk response is executed, you should record the actual outcomes compared to the initial projections, documenting both the success of the mitigation and any secondary risks that emerged during the response. These records serve as critical lessons for future project teams, preventing the recurrence of similar pitfalls in future cycles of work. If you neglect this step, you are effectively paying the same tuition for the same mistake multiple times. Archiving these results in the Project Management Information System provides a historical record that justifies deviations from the original plan when audits occur, keeping the project accountable to its stated goals. The integrated change control process serves as the gatekeeper for project stability during the messy reality of the execution phase. While you must prioritize flexibility to adapt to changing environments, this does not imply that the project baseline should be treated as a suggestion. Every proposed change resulting from a risk response must be evaluated against the project management plan to determine if it is truly necessary or if it represents scope creep disguised as a corrective action. By ensuring that only approved changes are implemented in the project work, you protect the team from wasted effort and keep stakeholders confident in the value delivery process. This requires a rigorous adherence to the Change Control Board's decisions before any physical task related to the change is initiated. Balancing the need for structural stability with the reality of project uncertainty defines the core competency of a modern project manager. Rigid adherence to a plan that is no longer representative of reality is a form of project failure. Yet ignoring the baseline entirely results in a project without a destination. Through effective communication, timely documentation, and strict adherence to defined change pathways, you create a project environment that can withstand uncertainty without losing sight of its objectives. This synthesis of discipline and adaptability ensures that your response strategies perform as intended and that the project remains a coherent entity. Ensure your reporting structures remain proactive, as stakeholders are far more forgiving of pivots that are explained clearly than they are of sudden, opaque shifts in strategy. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will explore the mechanisms of the integrated change control process, which serves as the formal gatekeeper for all modifications to project baselines. Change control is often misunderstood as a bureaucratic obstacle, yet in reality, is the primary engine for maintaining project integrity. When we speak of integrated change control, we are referring to the formal process of reviewing all change requests, approving them, and managing the resulting impact on deliverables and organizational process assets. At its core, this process ensures that no scope creep or unauthorized resource consumption occurs unnoticed. Every project exists within a baseline context, the approved version of a scope, schedule, or cost plan, and any deviation from this baseline must pass through a structured evaluation pipeline. By centralizing this authority, the project manager prevents fragmented decisions that could otherwise ripple into catastrophic failure. We look at changes holistically, meaning that an alteration in one area is never viewed in isolation from the rest of the project constraints. The central nervous system of this process is the Change Control Board, or CCB. This is a formally chartered group of stakeholders responsible for reviewing, evaluating, approving, deferring, or rejecting changes to the project. The project manager prepares the documentation, but the CCB holds the ultimate authority to decide the fate of a request, often based on the severity of the impact. When a change request is submitted, it is not merely a suggestion. It is a formal request to alter the project trajectory. Assessing the impact involves a rigorous analysis of the triple constraint: scope, schedule, and cost. If a change adds 10% to the scope, the impact assessment must quantify how much additional time is required and what the budgetary consequences will be. Furthermore, we must evaluate these changes against the project's risk profile, as an approved change might negate a previous risk mitigation strategy or introduce entirely new threats to the objective. Once the assessment is complete, the results are documented in the change log. The change log is our historical record of what was requested, who requested it, and how it was processed. If a change is approved, the project management plan must be updated to reflect the new baseline. This is where configuration management becomes essential. Configuration management ensures that every version of the project documentation is tracked, preventing the team from working off an obsolete drawing or requirement document. Without this discipline, you inevitably end up with version drift, where different departments are optimizing for different sets of assumptions. By maintaining strict control over these version documents, we provide transparency and accountability for every stakeholder involved in the work. It is not enough to simply approve a change. You must also ensure the physical and digital artifacts of the project are updated to match the new reality. Communication is the final, and perhaps most neglected, step in the integration process. Merely updating the documentation is insufficient if the stakeholders remain unaware of the shift in direction. Once a decision is made, regardless of whether it is an approval or a rejection, it must be communicated explicitly to those who are affected by the outcome. If an approval necessitates a change in resource allocation, the team members impacted must understand why the shift occurred and what is expected of them going forward. Stakeholders, particularly sponsors, expect clear reporting that shows how the project is moving closer or further away from its initial targets as a result of these integrated changes. By keeping these channels open, you protect the project from the perception of mismanagement or arbitrary decision-making. Communication fosters trust, and trust is what allows a project manager to maintain control even when the environment is highly volatile. While the process I have described feels inherently predictive, it is important to understand how these concepts map to agile environments. In a traditional predictive waterfall approach, the change control process is heavy and formal, often involving a signature-heavy CCB meeting. In contrast, agile projects prefer a more decentralized approach to change, relying on the product owner to constantly reprioritize the backlog. You might wonder if this means the CCB is dead, but that is rarely the case in large, regulated industries. Even in agile environments, systemic changes that affect the overall budget or project timeline usually involve a form of integrated change control to maintain alignment with executive leadership. The underlying principle remains identical. Assess the impact, verify the versioning, and communicate the outcome. Whether you're using a spreadsheet-based log or a digital board, the requirement to protect the project baseline is absolute. We have covered the fundamentals of managing changes and the processes that keep our projects aligned with their goals. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanisms required to monitor project work and effectively control the project scope to ensure alignment with the initial plan. Monitoring and controlling project work is essentially the process of tracking, reviewing, and reporting progress against the performance objectives defined in the project management plan. At its core, this activity relies on the transformation of raw data into actionable knowledge. We start with work performance data, which are the raw observations and measurements identified during activities or task execution. By comparing this raw data against the project management plan, we create work performance information. This information provides context, telling us if we are ahead of schedule, behind budget, or deviating from technical specifications. If we do not perform this comparison rigorously, we effectively lose control of the project trajectory. A project manager who only looks at the surface-level output without analyzing the underlying variance is essentially flying blind. Therefore, the goal is to transform disparate status reports into a cohesive narrative that informs our decision-making. Controlling the scope is a distinct, yet interconnected, challenge that frequently defines the success or failure of a project. The scope baseline, composed of the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary, serves as our primary reference point. When project work begins, stakeholders might introduce new requirements that were not part of the original agreement. This is where variance analysis becomes an essential tool set for the project manager. By identifying deviations between the planned work and the actual execution, we can quickly determine whether these deviations are manageable or if they signal a systemic problem. If the variance is significant, it implies that the project is no longer delivering what was originally promised. Identifying these deviations early allows for the implementation of change requests before the project drifts too far into uncharted territory. One of the most persistent threats to project stability is scope creep, which represents the uncontrolled expansion of project scope without adjustments to time, cost, and resources. Preventing scope creep requires a disciplined approach to the validation process, where we formally obtain acceptance of completed project deliverables. Through inspections, which involve measuring, examining, and testing to determine whether work meets requirements and product acceptance criteria, we confirm that the deliverables are indeed what the customer asked for. If an inspection reveals that a deliverable does not meet the specified standards, we must initiate a corrective action. This process is not merely a formality, but a gatekeeper that ensures only verified, high-quality work moves forward. By formalizing acceptance, we minimize the possibility of disputes at the end of the project when stakeholders evaluate the final result. We must distinguish clearly between necessary project requirements and the common pitfall known as gold plating. Gold plating refers to the practice of intentionally adding extra features to a product that were not authorized by the sponsor or the stakeholders. While a developer or a team member might believe that these additions improve the product, they are essentially unauthorized changes that consume resources without providing verified value. From a PMP perspective, this is a violation of the scope management plan and is considered poor project governance. Every feature must be tied directly to a requirement that was gathered during the initiation phase and approved in the planning phase. If a feature does not trace back to a requirement, the project manager must proactively prevent it from being included in the work. Staying within the defined boundaries is not about being rigid. It is about ensuring that the project remains economically viable and strategically aligned. Maintaining a clear line between the project management plan and actual execution is a balancing act that requires constant vigilance. We monitor the work to ensure we are doing what we said we would, and we control the scope to ensure we are not doing anything we did not say we would. This dual focus keeps the team productive and prevents the exhaustion that comes from chasing shifting targets. By utilizing metrics like variance analysis and conducting structure inspections, we move away from subjective assessments of progress. When we gather data, we analyze it. And when we analyze it, we make informed decisions that keep the project moving toward closure. These practices are the fundamental building blocks of a professional environment where scope is not a moving target, but a clearly defined path. Consistency in these areas builds trust with stakeholders and creates a repeatable framework for successful project delivery. I look forward to our next discussion. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will demystify the conceptual framework of earned value management, focusing on how these metrics translate into actionable project insights. Earned value management is often perceived as a daunting exercise in mathematics. Its true utility lies in its ability to translate project performance into a shared, objective language. At its core, it functions as a diagnostic tool that tells us how much value we have delivered relative to our planned effort and how much that value has cost us in real terms. Instead of looking at a budget and asking if we have spent the money allocated, we look at the progress of our work packages to determine if the spending is justified by the output. This shifts the conversation from subjective status updates to data-driven realities. Project managers often struggle when they look at costs in isolation because an underspent budget is not inherently good if the corresponding work items are significantly behind schedule. By standardizing our view of performance, we stop managing based on gut feelings and start managing based on established trends. This conceptual understanding is the prerequisite for any sophisticated analysis, ensuring that when we look at a report, we understand the health of the project at a single glance. To understand the health of any project, we must look at three fundamental data points: plan value, earned value, and actual cost. Plan value is simply the authorized budget assigned to the work scheduled to be completed by a given date, essentially representing what we intended to accomplish according to our baseline. Earned value is the measure of work actually performed expressed in terms of the budget authorized for that work, providing an objective representation of progress. Actual cost is the realized expense incurred for the work performed during a specific time period. If you have budgeted $10,000 for a concrete pouring task that should be halfway done today, your plan value is $5,000. If you have only finished 40% of the work, your earned value is $4,000, even if you have spent $6,000 in labor and materials. This discrepancy between the actual money spent and the worth of the completed work is exactly where the management intuition triggers. Once we have those three core measurements, we can derive ratios that tell us if our project is healthy or drifting. The Schedule Performance Index, or SPI, is the ratio of earned value to plan value, functioning as an indicator of progress efficiency. If the result is exactly 1, you are perfectly on schedule, while a result below 1 signifies that you are lagging behind your planned timeline. The Cost Performance Index, or CPI, represents the ratio of earned value to actual cost, telling us how efficiently we are using our financial resources. A CPI below 1 indicates that you're overspending for the value received, which is a classic warning sign of poor project execution or unforeseen technical debt. These indices are not static, but rather dynamic indicators that help us forecast the future of the project with a high degree of confidence. By tracking these metrics over consistent reporting periods, you gain the ability to spot negative trends early, often long before the project enters a state of critical failure. When we look ahead, we use these metrics to forecast completion results, such as the estimate at completion or the variance at completion. The variance at completion, or VC, represents the difference between the budget at completion and the current estimate at completion, revealing the expected budget surplus or deficit at the very end of the project. A positive variance is comforting, but a negative variance signals that you must take corrective action, such as decoping or resource reallocation, to bring the project back in line. The significance of this metric is not just in the number itself, but in the visibility it creates for organizational leadership. If you can communicate that your project is trending toward a specific cost overrun, you are managing expectations early. This allows for informed decision-making where you weigh the trade-offs between project quality, scope, and timeline against the reality of your current burn rate. Decisions made in the light of these metrics are almost always more defendable than those based on anecdotal status reports from team members. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now entering a critical phase where we shift our focus from planning and execution toward the rigorous monitoring and control of schedule and cost performance. Controlling the schedule and project costs is not merely about tracking numbers in a spreadsheet, but about understanding the dynamic relationship between time, resources, and fiscal reality. When we monitor the status of project activities, we are essentially taking the pulse of the project to determine if our current progress aligns with the approved baseline. The project manager must constantly compare actual activity durations against the planned schedule to identify variances early. If we detect that a project is falling behind, we have an array of tactical responses at our disposal, such as crashing or fast-tracking. Crashing involves adding resources to critical path activities to shorten the duration, often at the expense of increased costs, while fast-tracking allows us to perform phases or tasks in parallel that were originally planned sequentially. Both techniques require a careful evaluation of the trade-offs, as they inevitably introduce risks to quality and budget stability that must be documented and communicated clearly to the stakeholders. While the schedule dictates the tempo, the project budget serves as the fiscal constraint within which we must operate, requiring us to track spending meticulously against the cost baseline. When you manage a budget, your primary objective is to prevent unauthorized expenditures and ensure that every dollar disbursed contributes directly to the project's defined objective. This requires granular visibility into actual costs, which are then compared with the baseline to determine the variance. If the project exhibits a negative variance, meaning we are overspending, we must move beyond passive tracking and proactively implement corrective actions. These actions are often formalized through an integrated change control process where we reallocate funds or revisit the resource plan to bring expenditures back into equilibrium. Failing to address these budget slips in real time can lead to a state where the project becomes financially insolvent long before its intended completion date. Forecasting techniques play an essential role here by allowing us to project the future state of the project based on current performance trends. By calculating metrics like the estimate at completion, we can provide sponsors and stakeholders with a realistic outlook rather than a hopeful one. These projections are based on hard data, such as our Cost Performance Index and Schedule Performance Index, which distill complex project health data into easily understandable ratios. If the index is below 1, it is a clear indicator that we are either over budget or behind schedule, necessitating immediate intervention. As a project manager, you must treat these forecasts as tools for transparency rather than indicators of failure. By accurately predicting future performance, we can justify the need for schedule adjustments or budget contingency usage in a way that is logical, data-driven, and defensible during management reviews. Ultimately, controlling schedule and cost performance demands that you remain disciplined in your application of project management processes, ensuring that changes are managed rather than merely recorded. When we look at the critical path, we're focusing our energy on the sequence of activities that dictates the final delivery date, as any slippage here directly impacts the overall project timeline. Integrating these controls into the wider project framework prevents the scope creep and resource mismanagement that so often lead to project failure. You are essentially building a feedback loop where the data flowing back from the execution phase informs the corrective measures taken in the control phase. This constant recalibration ensures that the team remains focused on the critical deliverables while maintaining the rigor needed to satisfy institutional governance requirements. By mastering these two areas, you ensure that the path from project initiation to completion is mapped, measured, and consistently accounted for. I will see you in our next technical discussion. Welcome back. We are now turning our analytical focus toward the critical intersection of risk management and quality control within the monitoring phase of your project. In this chapter, we will master the technical rigor required to maintain project integrity through disciplined risk reassessment and objective quality measurement. You will learn how to transition from planning to active oversight, ensuring that your project does not merely drift toward completion, but hits its defined targets. The risk register is not a static document created during the initiation phase. It is a living artifact that demands continuous scrutiny throughout the project lifecycle. As you move through execution, new risks invariably emerge from technical dependencies, stakeholder shifts, or external market fluctuations, requiring you to update the register periodically. By establishing a routine for risk review meetings, you ensure that the team remains vigilant rather than complacent, which is a common failure mode in complex project environments. This proactive identification allows you to pivot your strategies before an issue manifests as a project derailment. Assessing the effectiveness of your risk responses through audits is equally vital, as it provides an empirical basis for determining whether your mitigation tactics are actually delivering the intended protection. If an audit reveals that a specific response is failing to reduce the probability or impact of a risk, you must be prepared to adjust your contingency plans immediately. This iterative cycle of identification, assessment, and audit forms the backbone of responsive project governance. Treating risk management as an ongoing exercise rather than a one-time setup is exactly what separates competent practitioners from those who simply follow a checklist. While risk management protects the project from future uncertainty, quality control confirms that current deliverables meet the established technical requirements and customer expectations. You should employ statistical sampling when testing every single unit of a deliverable is either impossible or economically unfeasible. By selecting a representative subset of the total output, you can make valid inferences about the quality level of the entire population with a high degree of confidence. Control charts serve as your primary analytical tool in this endeavor, as they allow you to track process stability over time by highlighting variations within or beyond predefined control limits. If you observe data points crossing these limits or showing patterns indicative of non-random behavior, you must investigate the root cause of the process instability. This involves more than just identifying defects. It requires a systematic review of the underlying mechanisms that produce the output in the first place. You are essentially looking for signs that the process, not just the product, has drifted away from its intended specification. Technical reviews and inspections provide the formal infrastructure needed to verify that the work performed matches the project baseline. These are not informal chats, but structured verification events where stakeholders compare deliverables against the quality management plan and the scope statement. When a quality issue is uncovered during these inspections, your responsibility is to ensure that it is addressed through systematic rework or process adjustments before the deliverables ever reach the client. Rework must be documented to understand its impact on the project budget and schedule, as excessive rework often signals a systemic failure in the preliminary quality planning. By tightening the feedback loop between inspection results and process correction, you minimize the risk of handing over a product that fails to satisfy the user. Maintaining this level of discipline requires a firm adherence to project standards, ensuring that every deliverable undergoes the necessary verification steps without exception. Ultimately, Your goal in controlling quality is to build a predictable, repeatable pipeline that consistently produces outputs which satisfy the predefined acceptance criteria. This level of rigor ensures that you are constantly validating the project's health while mitigating threats to its successful closure. See you in the next session. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the critical processes of monitoring communications and governing procurement activities to ensure project health and vendor accountability. Monitoring communications is not merely a bureaucratic task of checking if status reports were sent on time, but rather a deliberate evaluation of whether the information exchange actually meets the needs of stakeholders. When we manage communications, we establish a plan, but during the monitoring phase, we must look for evidence of effectiveness by assessing whether stakeholders are receiving, understanding, and acting upon the information. If you find that a particular governance team is not receiving the level of detail they require to make informed decisions, you are observing a misalignment. Correcting this involves returning to your communication management plan and adjusting the frequency, format, or distribution methods to address the identified gaps. You should treat communication as a dynamic system where the feedback loop is just as important as the dissemination of data. By maintaining high visibility into the status of these efforts, you ensure that transparency is not just an ideal, but a consistent reality throughout the project lifecycle. Procurement control, often referred to as the control procurements process, shifts the focus from the initial selection of vendors to the operational management of the contractual relationship. Your primary objective here is to ensure that both the buyer and the seller are performing according to the terms of the signed agreement. This requires a structured approach to monitoring contract performance, which often involves reviewing vendor deliverables against the defined acceptance criteria. If a vendor falls behind schedule or fails to meet the quality standards specified in the statement of work, you must intervene early to prevent a minor issue from escalating into a project-critical failure. You should maintain comprehensive records of these interactions, as formal documentation is the foundation upon which any contractual modification or remediation must be built. This transparency serves as a safeguard for the project, ensuring that the project manager can provide a factual account of vendor performance at any given moment. One of the most effective tools in the procurement control toolkit is the audit, which allows you to systematically verify that the seller is complying with the contract terms and that the project is receiving the value promised. Audits and inspections are proactive measures designed to identify non-compliance early, rather than discovering a deficiency at the bitter end of a delivery phase. When discrepancies arise, which is common in complex environments, you must pivot toward dispute resolution strategies. Negotiation is always the first line of defense, as it preserves the working relationship and avoids the high costs associated with litigation. If negotiation fails, you may resort to alternative dispute resolution methods like mediation or arbitration to reach a settlement without involving the court system. Each resolution must be documented, and once the obligations under a specific contract are fulfilled, you must perform a formal procurement closeout. The closeout process involves verifying that all products or services have been accepted, finalizing any outstanding invoices, and ensuring the administrative closure of the contract. Failing to properly close out procurements often leads to orphaned invoices or undefined ownership of warranties and maintenance support. You want to ensure that as each procurement component concludes, the project record remains pristine, reflecting accurate costs and performance indicators. This administrative rigor ensures that the broader project budget and scope management remain tightly connected to the actual outcomes of your vendor engagements. When you treat procurement control as a methodical tracking of obligations rather than a reactive firefighting exercise, you significantly reduce the risk profile of your project. Ultimately, The integration of effective communication loops and vigilant procurement oversight provides the project management team with the clarity required to protect the project's overall health and ensures that stakeholder expectations remain aligned with reality. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back to the final phase of our journey, where we shift our focus from execution to the formal closure and transition of project deliverables. In this session, we will examine the systematic process of wrapping up all project activities and ensuring organizational assets are preserved. Closing a project is not merely a formality, but a critical governance step that ensures the organization realizes the intended business value. When a project concludes, the primary objective is to verify that all deliverables meet the acceptance criteria defined in the project charter and scope statement. This requires formal sign-off from the project sponsor, which acts as the legal and operational bridge between the project team and the performing organization. Without this formal acceptance, the project manager remains technically responsible for the project deliverables, which creates unnecessary liability. You should consider the formal sign-off as the definitive moment where ownership of the product or service shifts from the temporary project team to the permanent operations department. If the project resulted in a software product, this handover includes moving code into production, transferring support documentation, and ensuring the operational team possesses the knowledge to maintain the output. Always verify that the project management plan and the product specifications align perfectly during this final audit. Once the product is successfully handed over, the focus shifts to the administrative closure of the project infrastructure, starting with the release of team members and equipment. Releasing resources back to the organization is an exercise in resource management efficiency because it ends the project's burn rate. You must ensure that each team member has been evaluated and transitioned according to the human resource management plan, which often involves returning functional staff to their original departments. Simultaneously, any procurement contracts that were active during the project must be formally closed out. This stage involves verifying that all deliverables have been provided by suppliers, final payments have been authorized, and any disputes have been resolved through the established contractual process. Leaving a contract open beyond the project's natural end can create financial risk and complicate the company's legal standing. Therefore, audit your list of vendors meticulously to ensure no lingering obligations remain before officially closing the procurement cycle. Capturing institutional knowledge is perhaps the most neglected aspect of project management, yet it represents the greatest value for future endeavors. Conducting a final lessons learned session allows the team to reflect on what went well and where processes failed, providing a candid assessment of the project's actual performance. It is essential that you facilitate this session without blame, focusing instead on data-driven observations that the organization can use to improve its maturity level. Once collected, these insights must be documented in the organizational process assets to form a permanent knowledge base for future project managers. Along with these lessons learned, all historical project artifacts, including plans, logs, and meeting minutes, must be archived. Reliable archiving dictates that documents are stored in an accessible format that aligns with company policy, ensuring that if a project is audited years later, the records remain intact. This archival step effectively sanitizes the project workspace and formally documents the history of the work performed. Finally, we address the evaluation of success through the post-implementation review, which links the projects into the original business case. This review is intended to measure the actual business value realized compared to the projections made during the initiation phase. If the project was expected to reduce operational costs by 20%, this review calculates whether that target was actually achieved in the months following the handover. This is also the time to acknowledge the team's efforts, as celebrating project success is a necessary cultural component that maintains morale for future assignments. While project management is often viewed as a series of technical controls, The human element of acknowledging completion is what builds high-performing teams for the long term. You should view this final review as the culmination of your duties, ensuring that the organization not only receives the product, but also understands its strategic impact. With the administrative chores completed and the outcomes measured, the project is officially considered closed. See you in the next installment.